A thin strip of light cuts across his smile as he sets a glass down between us. The room holds its breath with me, the narrow beams slicing through the half-dark, like it's trying to choose which of us it wants to expose first. The glass reflection flickers across his cheek, catching on the curve of his mouth, as if it's trying to tell me a truth I'm already carrying. He speaks casually the way someone does when they believe nothing is out of place, when they believe the room is still theirs to command. I can feel the controlled distance in my own breathing, the cold steadiness forming in my chest, as I watch him tap the glass once with his fingertip, a gesture too relaxed for the weight beneath it. He asks me about my day, about errands he doesn't care about. His tone warm but hollow, a performance he's unaware he's giving. I nod in the right places, letting my voice drift quietly, because anything louder might crack the air between us. The dim edges of the room shape themselves around his outline, wrapping him in alternating bands of shadow and invitation. A visual contradiction I can't unsee. My hands rest on my knees, still deliberate, resisting the instinct to reach for the suitcase waiting behind the wall, a silent accusation he hasn't even noticed. The air is thick with the muted hum of the refrigerator and the distant swell of traffic outside, sounds that make the scene feel suspended, like time has agreed to slow long enough for me to witness him, as he is unaware, comfortable, unguarded. He leans back slightly, the strip of light dividing his face into two versions of him, the man he pretends to be and the man I've finally learned to see. He laughs softly, a sound that lands wrong too light against the tension under my skin. When he lifts the glass and the reflection shifts, something inside me notes the movement with the precision of a measured breath. I'm cataloging everything. The cadence of his sentences, the looseness of his posture, the way his eyes drift away and return as though rehearsing sincerity. I answer with restrained politeness, the echo of my voice sounding foreign to me. He doesn't notice. He never does when he's performing. The moment stretches quiet and calculated, and I feel the edges of the truth I've gathered pressing gently against the surface of my composure. His smile widens as he asks whether I'm quiet, because I'm tired or thinking or simply distracted. He doesn't realize the question is a spotlight he just turned onto himself. His gentleness feels borrowed, like he's wearing an emotion he doesn't own anymore. I tilt my head, letting my gaze drift toward the glass, the reflection stirring with each movement he makes, and I feel my resolve solidify. My silence isn't emptiness, it's preparation. The light fractures again as he shifts the glass closer to me, as though bridging a distance he doesn't understand he created. I meet his eyes, and for a brief beat, I see the version of us I stayed, for the version I kept believing in, long after the evidence began whispering otherwise. But belief is fragile. Truth is persistent. He clears his throat and asks if I want to go out tomorrow. His voice too smooth, too conveniently hopeful. I give a small smile that doesn't reach my eyes. The suitcase waits in the hallway, zipped packed, almost trembling with the weight of unspoken decisions. He doesn't know I touched the handle before sitting down, rehearsing the moment I'd rise. The thought of leaving used to frighten me. Now it steadies me. The glass reflection shivers again, and for the first time I recognize it as something like permission. He takes another sip, oblivious to the storm forming in the quiet I keep. He asks what I'm thinking, leaning forward, slightly lowering his voice like we're sharing something intimate. He doesn't realize intimacy broke long before this moment. The air feels sharp, full of light that doesn't warm. I let my answer slip out soft enough to be mistaken for tiredness. I watch him accept it, without question, his confidence in my compliance, almost tender in its carelessness. The truth sits between us unspoken, but fully formed, waiting for me to stand and let it breathe. His smile lingers unaware of its own fading relevance. The room seems to tilt gently, aligning itself with my decision. The refrigerator hum deepens. The light shifts. The glass brightens at its edge. I breathe in slowly, not trembling, not unsure. The moment is here quiet and exact. And when I imagine the feel of the suitcase handle in my grip, the image settles like a final note in a song already finished. The light cuts across his expression one last time, splitting the man he is from the man he pretends to be, and the scene freezes in my mind with perfect clarity. I am already gone. I'm back in the days before the break, when the air in the house still felt neutral and the mornings carried a kind of muted promise. The sky was pale, the kind of gray that never fully commits to rain, and Evan moved through the kitchen with practiced ease. His keys landed on the counter with a faint metallic tap, the silver key sliding slightly out of place, as though nudged by an unseen hesitation. I watched him from the doorway, waiting for the familiar rhythm of our morning routine to settle, but something in the scene felt misaligned, like a picture frame tilted a few degrees off-center. His smile appeared polite and unhurried, but his gaze slipped past me instead of landing where it used to. He asked about my plans for the day without really listening, a question shaped like habit rather than interest. I remember glancing at the window, noticing how a faint reflection trembled across the glass, flickering with the breeze outside. It was subtle, a brief shimmer that didn't belong to anything in the room, but it struck me with an inexplicable sense of warning. I dismissed it quickly, telling myself I was tired, that I was reading too much into nothing. Evan opened the fridge, rummaging for something he never found, talking about needing to leave early for a meeting. His voice was stable, but his body angled away from me, his shoulders tense in a way he thought he hid well. I lifted his jacket from the back of the chair, handing it to him, and that's when I first noticed the unfamiliar scent. Faint, warm, unfamiliar. Not mine, not ours. It clung to the fabric softly enough to touch a nerve I wasn't ready to acknowledge. I told myself it was detergent or the air outside or the lingering smell of someone brushing past him. I told myself anything except the truth, forming quietly beneath the surface. He thanked me, barely meeting my eyes. His hand brushed mine, a casual touch that should have grounded me, but instead it felt distant, like he was performing closeness rather than offering it. He checked his watch twice, even though he wasn't running late. Small gestures, tiny cracks. I thought about asking if everything was all right, if something was bothering him, if I was imagining the shift. But something held me back, a quiet instinct, a thin thread of caution pulling at the edge of my thoughts. He kissed my temple gently, before leaving the gesture too light, too quick, like a closing punctuation mark on a sentence he didn't intend to finish. The space he left behind felt heavier than the moment should have allowed. I stood there a few seconds longer, listening to the fading sound of his footsteps down the driveway, waiting for my breath to settle. The silver key lay unmoved on the counter, catching a sliver of the weak morning light. I reached out and touched it absently, feeling the cold metal as if it might offer clarity. Instead, the unsettled feeling deepened, subtle but insistent. The reflection on the window trembled again, just as I turned away, a brief flicker that made me pause, but only for a moment. I ignored it, choosing comfort over intuition, unaware that it was the first quiet signal that something in our foundation had already shifted out of place. I moved through the rest of the morning, convincing myself nothing was wrong, but a small weight had already formed behind my ribs, a foreshadowing I didn't yet have the courage to interpret. The day carried on like any other, but the imbalance lingered in whispers I refused to hear. The light in the kitchen dimmed slightly as clouds rolled in, and the key glinted faintly, waiting for the truth it would eventually unlock. I didn't plan on picking up his phone that night. I told myself I was only moving it from the couch cushion before it slipped between the seams, that I was doing something ordinary, something harmless. The living room was lit only by the soft spill of a floor lamp, the kind of light that leaves more in shadow than it reveals. Evan had gone upstairs to shower, humming faintly, unaware of the silence tightening behind him. When I lifted the phone, I noticed immediately that the screen was already awake, the glow sharp against the dim room. A fine crack traced across the upper corner, a small fracture catching the light just enough to resemble something trembling. I ran my thumb lightly along the edge, feeling the uneven texture, as though the object itself was warning me of the break I was about to witness. I shouldn't have looked closer, but the notification pulsed faintly, drawing my attention like a whisper. My breath held without instruction as I tapped the screen. The gallery was open, not messages, not calls, but the gallery. A single image sat at the top, recently saved. When I opened it, the first thing I saw wasn't the subject, but the timestamp. Ref LN22. Time 10:14 p.m. The same hour he claimed he was stuck at the office chatting with a client over a delayed report. But the lighting in the photo told a different story, warmer, softer, not the sterile brightness of his workspace. And the angle of the reflection in the glass behind whoever took the picture didn't match the office at all. A chill spread over my shoulders, not sharp, but slow and certain. The screenshot wasn't incriminating on its own, not in a way a stranger might understand, but it was wrong. Wrong in the subtle way that only someone living inside the relationship would notice. Wrong in the way his voice had felt distant. Wrong in the way the unfamiliar scent had clung to his jacket. Wrong in the way the silver key had been left on the counter earlier that morning. The pieces weren't forming a picture yet, but they were rolling toward one. I stared at the image longer than I should have, the cracked phone screen creating thin fractures across the photo, distorting it just enough to make everything look unsettled. Evan came down the stairs at that moment, towel around his neck, footsteps soft against the carpet. I locked the phone quickly, placing it face down on the arm of the chair, as if it had never left its place. My heartbeat flattened itself into something quietly obedient the way it always did when I needed to hide the flicker of alarm. He smiled at me, unaware, adjusting the towel casually, as he asked if I wanted tea or something sweeter. I nodded my voice, choosing silence rather than answer. He moved into the kitchen, humming again, and I found myself staring at the back of his shirt, the fabric shifting as he reached for the kettle. There was no guilt in his posture, no hesitation, no trace of someone who had just lied about where he'd been. And maybe that was what unsettled me most, the ease of it, the smoothness, the seamless delivery of a truth that had never been true. Some lies aren't spoken. They're performed so effortlessly, they feel rehearsed. He returned with 2 mugs, placing mine gently on the table. Steam curled upward briefly, illuminating the tension between us before fading into the air. The faint scent from his jacket, still lingering in my memory, felt suddenly deliberate. I wanted to ask about the screenshot. I wanted to ask why his phone was left open. I wanted to ask why the timestamp didn't match anything he told me earlier. But the questions sat heavy on my tongue, unspoken, because I knew once they were out, they couldn't be taken back. Instead, I thanked him for the tea. My voice sounded distant, unfamiliar even to me. He sat beside me close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him, but far enough for the air between us to feel divided. When he leaned in to kiss my shoulder, a shiver tightened the line of my spine. Not because of affection, but because I didn't know which version of him was touching me. I waited until he looked away before reaching for the phone again, pretending to adjust a pillow. The cracked screen glinted faintly, as if acknowledging our secret. The screenshot remained etched in my mind, the timestamp beating like a quiet pulse. He asked if I wanted to watch something before bed. I said maybe. He didn't hear the hesitation. He only heard the part that made his evening easier. He stretched his arm across the back of the couch, completely unaware that something had shifted so fundamentally I could feel the split beneath my ribs. The moment trust cracks, even silence develops sharp edges. I excused myself to the bathroom, telling him I was brushing my teeth. Once the door closed, I leaned against it, letting the cool wood steady me. I replayed the timestamp in my head. 10:14 p.m. 10:14 p.m. 10:14 p.m. The echo threaded itself through my breath until it no longer sounded like a number, but like a door beginning to open into a darker room. I turned on the faucet to cover the sound of my thoughts and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The light flickered slightly, casting a faint shimmer across the glass, though the tremble wasn't as clear as before. I splashed water on my face, but the chill didn't erase the growing certainty settling into me. When I finally returned to the living room, he was already half asleep, comfortable, content, unaware of the evidence waiting quietly inside the cracked phone resting beside him. I sat down slowly, the weight of the moment pressing into the quiet between us. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. not with the truth beginning to take shape behind his smile. The night deepened soft and deceptive, but something in me had already moved beyond it. The phone remained on the cushioned screen dark, but the fracture had already begun. A quiet truth settles hardest when no one sees it forming. I didn't follow him that day. At least that's what I told myself while my car rolled slowly into the crowded lot outside the cafe. It was coincidence, I insisted. An impulse, a mere detour after running errands. But the truth is simpler and quieter. Something in me already knew the direction his lies pointed, and my body moved before my reasoning had time to catch up. The sky was turning the color of steel, and the wind carried a hint of rain slicing the air with thin pockets of cold. Inside the cafe, lights glowed warm, and the hum of conversation spilled through the glass each time the door opened. I hesitated near the entrance, my hand gripping the metal handle until the chill bit into my palm. When I finally stepped inside, the shift in temperature wrapped around me like a false comfort. The room smelled of roasted beans and caramel syrup, a scent tied to happier memories I hadn't revisited in months. And then I saw him. Evan sat near the back beneath a dim lamp, its yellow glow casting a narrow circle over the small table. The rest of the room bustled in soft, chaotic motion, but the space around him felt almost staged. He leaned forward with a softness I hadn't seen him offer in weeks. The woman across from him, her hair falling in loose curls, her expression somewhere between nervous and hopeful, met his glance with a familiarity that struck me like an aftershock. My breath stalled as I realized I had never seen him look at me that way. A gentle tilt of his head, a quiet smile that didn't seem borrowed. He wasn't touching her, not quite, but he occupied the air around her with an intimacy he hadn't shown me in far too long. I froze near the doorway, blending into the line of customers as if I were a ghost moving through the space. My heart didn't race. It didn't break. It simply folded inward slowly and neatly like something delicate being packed away. Marcy spotted me before I saw her. She worked part-time behind the counter, her curly hair piled loosely on her head, her bright eyes widening the moment she recognized me. She mouthed my name, then shook her head, not out of denial but warning. She stepped out from behind the espresso machine and approached me with urgent softness. "Claire," she whispered, glancing nervously toward Evan. "Listen, you shouldn't see this." Her voice trembled with something like empathy, or maybe pity. I didn't respond. My gaze remained fixed on the scene beneath the dim lamp. The woman laughed quietly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Evan mirrored the gesture with a smile too tender to misinterpret. It wasn't flirtation anymore. It was something practiced, something warm, something he once saved for me. Marcy placed a gentle hand on my arm, but the room felt far away, the noise muffled beneath the rising pulse in my ears. "Claire," she whispered again, "you need to know. I recorded something earlier because it didn't feel right." She lifted her cracked phone from her apron pocket, angling the screen toward me. A small video file glowed at the center, a thumbnail showing Evan leaning in close to the woman. The timestamp burned clearly at the top, 3:42 p.m. Evidence number 2. My throat tightened as I hit play. The video lasted only 9 seconds, but it was long enough to capture the softness in his expression, the easy familiarity in his posture, the way his hand hovered near hers without touching, like a promise he intended to keep but didn't want to be seen making. The camera jerked slightly as Marcy hid the phone, her breathing audible. When the clip ended, she inhaled shakily. "I didn't want to assume anything," she murmured, "but I knew you'd want the truth." I thanked her with a voice that didn't sound like mine. She squeezed my arm once more before stepping back behind the counter, leaving me suspended in the moment. I watched Evan laugh again, watched the woman tuck her hair behind her ear again, watched the dim lamp catch the gold in its shade, as though spotlighting just how far I had drifted from his orbit. I stood there until my legs began to ache. I didn't cry. I didn't confront. The betrayal wasn't sharp. It was slow, like ink spreading through paper, shaping a stain that could never be returned to white. My phone buzzed in my pocket, Evan texting to ask how my day was going. My breath shook for the first time. It's strange how lies grow heavier when spoken politely. I stepped backward, pushing through the door with the last of my steadiness. The cold outside hit me like clarity. The rain hadn't started yet, but the air smelled like it would. People passed me umbrellas tucked under their arms, not noticing the quiet collapse happening just a few feet from them. I crossed the street without looking back. The cafe windows glowed behind me, warm and golden, but the light felt artificial now. A performance, a frame around a moment I was never meant to see. As I reached my car, the wind lifted a strand of my hair, brushing it across my cheek, like a final touch of the life I had known. I gripped the door handle, steadying myself. The timestamp pulsed in my mind. 3:42 p.m., 9 seconds of truth. A dim lamp, a quiet betrayal, a room full of witnesses who didn't even know they were witnessing something. I breathed once deeply and opened the car door. Some scenes erase the life you had before you walked into them. The house felt too quiet when I returned, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for me to acknowledge what I had seen. I closed the door softly, letting the muted click settle into the silence. Evan's car was already in the driveway. He must have come home early, unaware that I had watched him search for comfort in someone else's presence beneath the dim lamp. My steps were careful on the hardwood floor, like I was moving through a dream I hadn't agreed to have. The kitchen counter held the remnants of his afternoon mail, scattered a half-finished cup of tea, and his wristwatch placed the way he always left it when he wanted to feel unburdened. The metal caught the low kitchen light, reflecting a thin band across the surface, making the room appear sharper around its edges. I picked it up, turning it slowly in my hand. The ticking felt uneven, as though even time had begun slipping out of rhythm with him. And with me. My fingers tightened around it before I set it back down gently, like placing a fragile truth I wasn't ready to speak aloud. Evan called from upstairs, his tone warm, casual, unaware of the quiet unraveling beneath the floorboards. I answered with a voice steadier than I felt, telling him I'd be up in a minute. He believed it immediately. I scanned the counter again, noticing a folded paper tucked partly under a magazine. At first I assumed it was another bill, something mundane, but the number printed at the top caught my eye, Hat R51. I unfolded it slowly, the thin paper crackling at the edges. It was an appointment receipt, dated, time-stamped, and signed. He had told me he was at a meeting during that hour, stuck in traffic afterward. But the appointment time was earlier by a full 40 minutes, and the location wasn't anywhere near where he'd claimed to be. Evidence number 3. My thumb brushed over the printed ink as though the truth might smear if I pressed too hard, but it didn't. It held fast, and in that moment something inside me clicked into place. Not anger, not fear, but a sharpened clarity, like stepping into a room where the lights have finally stopped flickering. I folded the receipt neatly, placing it beside the wristwatch. The two objects sat together like an accusation arranged with deliberate care. I breathed deeply, letting the air settle inside me before moving through the rest of the kitchen. A faint, sweet scent lingered near the sink, the same one I'd noticed on his jacket. Not overwhelming, not damning, but persistent. It clung to the air in a way that made me wonder how long it had been present without my noticing. I poured myself a glass of water, the sound falling softly into the thick quiet. Halfway up the stairs, I paused, listening. He was humming again. A low, aimless tune, something content people hum when they believe they're safe. The ease in his voice felt like a lie made audible. I collected myself before stepping into the bedroom doorway. Evan sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through something on his phone, his posture relaxed, shoulders slightly slouched. He smiled when he saw me gesturing for me to sit beside him. I did, leaving a small space between us that he didn't seem to notice. He talked about his day, glossing over details the way he always did when he wanted the version of the story he liked best. I watched him closely, my gaze drifting to his hands, the slight tension in his knuckles, the absent-minded tapping of his thumb against the comforter, tiny rhythms that betrayed his calm. When he asked about my afternoon, I described errands and deadlines. He nodded, offering soft sympathy, as though he had any idea what kind of weight I carried now. My eyes moved to the clock on the nightstand, then back to him. Timing. Everything circled back, to timing what he said, what he didn't, what the evidence recorded without emotion. I shifted slightly. You said your meeting ran late, I asked, my tone even. Evan didn't hesitate. Yeah, terrible traffic leaving the office. A clean lie, a practiced one. He continued scrolling, unaware of the shift in me. I didn't challenge him. Not yet. His confidence in the lie settled into the room like dust on untouched furniture, quiet but pervasive. He set his phone aside and leaned back on his palms, exhaling deeply, clearly, pleased to have the day behind him. I stared at him for a long moment, memorizing this version of him, the one who believed the truth was still tucked out of sight. Later, when he showered, I returned to the kitchen. The wristwatch and the receipt were still there, illuminated softly by the under-cabinet light. I sat down, letting the stillness wrap around me. I replayed everything. The woman's smile, his posture beneath the dim lamp, the timestamp pulsing on Marcy's phone, the uneven tick of the watch. I lined up the puzzle pieces one by one until the shape began to emerge. Not fully, not yet, but enough to recognize the outline. I placed the receipt in a drawer so he wouldn't see it. Not because I intended to protect him, because I intended to watch the truth unfold precisely without interruption. Some revelations don't erupt. They accumulate until silence can no longer contain them. When I turned off the kitchen light, the last glint from the wristwatch faded slowly like a small star dying out. I stood there a moment longer, absorbing the quiet, letting the understanding settle fully into me. I wasn't imagining anything. The timeline was breaking. The lies were aligning. The truth was beginning to articulate itself. And tomorrow, or the day after that, I knew I would find the next fracture. I closed the drawer softly and stepped away. Sometimes the smallest evidence opens the longest shadows. I found the mirror shard on a Tuesday afternoon, though it felt like the day had been waiting far longer to place it in my path. The house was dim, lit only by the thin strokes of daylight slipping between the blinds, the air carrying the quiet hum of an afternoon caught between calm and collapse. I was moving through the bedroom, trying to straighten what didn't need straightening, when something sharp flashed at the edge of the dresser. A small, uneven shard of mirror lay near the base of Evan's cologne bottle, catching a narrow beam of light. I lifted it carefully, angling it between my fingers. The edge was cool, precise, reflecting a sliver of my face in fragmented shapes. For a moment, I saw myself divided past on one side, present on the other, and the image unsettled me. The shard must have come from the old pocket mirror he carried in his gym bag, though I couldn't remember the last time he'd used it, or why it had broken. The light refracted along the shard, throwing thin lines across the wall, and I whispered the words aloud without thinking. The fractured light splits the truth I tried to ignore. Hearing it out loud settled something in me, like a quiet agreement between myself and the room. The motif that had followed me from that trembling reflection on the kitchen window now stood here sharpened into something undeniable. I didn't notice the camera at first. Not until I bent to place the shard on the dresser and caught a glimpse of its lens peeking from behind a stack of books. His camera wasn't usually left out. Evan guarded his equipment with the same care he rarely extended to our conversations. I picked it up, my pulse quickening even before I powered it on. The screen flickered, then steadied. A single clip was cued for review. Ref C09. The timestamp glowed at the bottom. The file had been saved automatically, which meant he hadn't edited or filtered it yet. When I played it, the first thing I noticed wasn't the subject but the light. A reflection subtle then startling splintered across the frame, bending unnaturally. It came from the wrong direction. The angle of the glow didn't match the time of day the clip was labeled for. The sun couldn't have cast that reflection at that hour. It was impossible. And then the second impossibility, the background. He had said he took the footage outside his office building around 5 p.m., but the long shadows in the clip belonged to a late morning sun. The reflection in the glass door behind him wasn't from his building at all. Evidence number 4. The contradiction landed with a cold certainty, sharper than the shard still resting on the dresser. My breath stilled completely as I replayed the clip, studying every frame. Evan spoke to someone just beyond the camera's edge, his voice lower than usual, almost careful. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, gentle, attentive, threaded with something he hadn't given me in months. The camera shifted slightly, catching a fleeting image of the woman's silhouette reflected behind him. Her posture was relaxed, familiar, leaning in just enough to erase the boundary he'd claimed existed. The reflection revealed a truth his words had tried to bury. I lowered the camera slowly, my hand trembling despite the steadiness I forced into my breath. The room darkened as a cloud drifted across the window, muting the fractured light. I sat on the edge of the bed, the camera heavy in my palms, and let the reality settle into the space between my ribs. He hadn't just lied about the time. He hadn't just lied about the place. He had lied about the nature of the moment itself. The shard on the dresser caught a thin ray of returning sunlight, scattering it again across the wall. The broken reflection looked like a map of the cracks forming inside me. I replayed the clip a third time, and this time I noticed something even more unsettling, the sound of his breath hitching lightly when she stepped closer. Not nervousness, anticipation, a softness meant for someone he wanted to impress. The sound stung more than the sight. I set the camera down and pressed my fingertips against my temples. Everything felt too loud and too quiet at once. I thought of the silver key, the unfamiliar scent, the screenshot ref LN22, the appointment receipt with the mismatched timestamp, all of them pieces of a puzzle I had tried to assemble patiently, rationally. But this reflection-based contradiction was the first piece that snapped into place with irrefutable clarity. My heart didn't break. It aligned. The truth was no longer something hovering at the edge of understanding. It stood fully formed before me, illuminated by fractured light and a timestamp that couldn't lie. I walked to the window, watching the afternoon sun sift through the blinds, splitting into narrow bars of brightness across the floor. Evan had built his story in the shadows, trusting I wouldn't look closely at the angles. But the light told its own story, a story he didn't control. Some truths don't surface gently. They tear through the reflection you trusted most. I picked up the mirror shard again, letting it tilt until it caught a perfect line of sunlight. The beam split into two jagged paths across the floor, intersecting like a warning. I traced the light with my eyes, feeling a strange calm settle into me, the kind that comes once denial has finally surrendered to evidence. The clip, Ref C09, still glowed faintly on the camera screen, waiting, undeniable. I turned it off, set it beside the shard, and let the weight of certainty anchor me. I knew now that whatever came next wouldn't be a question of trust, it would be a question of exit. A clean exit, one he would never see coming. I stood in the quiet bedroom, letting the fractured light settle across my hands. The truth sharpens when you stop shielding your eyes from it. Nolan asked me to meet him in a hallway I didn't know existed, a narrow, almost forgotten corridor behind the HR offices, where the lights hummed louder than the conversations of the people who passed through the main lobby. I followed the sound of that hum until I found him standing beside a small table stacked with employee forms. His glasses sat crooked on the bridge of his nose, and he straightened them when he saw me, as though preparing himself for a conversation he already regretted having. He greeted me quietly, glancing over his shoulder, checking whether anyone had followed. Then he reached into his folder and pulled out a torn envelope, the edges jagged like someone had opened it in haste or anger. "I thought you should see this," he said. He handed it to me, and I felt the thin paper tremble slightly between my fingers, as if it recognized the weight of what it contained. Inside was a printed schedule, HR's record of employee hours requests and worksite assignments. The top of the page read, Ref HR 7B. The date matched the day Evan said he had been in back-to-back meetings. But the schedule told a different story entirely. He hadn't been assigned to the office at the time he claimed. He hadn't been in any meeting. He hadn't even been scheduled to be on site. He had signed out 2 hours earlier with no explanation. "This shouldn't be torn," Nolan murmured, noticing the way my eyes lingered on the ripped envelope. But someone didn't want it to be seen. His voice lowered. "It's not standard, Claire. None of this is." A cold steadiness washed over me. The page felt heavier than its actual weight, as though the truth printed on it was sinking through my skin. I traced the torn edge with my thumb, absorbing the implication someone either through carelessness or urgency had tried to hide this. Someone had taken time to tear open the envelope, remove it, review it, and then leave it where it might never resurface. But it resurfaced, and it reached me. Where was he then? I asked, though the question felt rhetorical. Nolan's eyes softened in a way that made me feel exposed, not comforted. I don't know, he said, but it wasn't here. The moment truth loses its alibi, silence becomes evidence. He stepped back, giving me room to breathe, as if the corridor itself had grown too narrow to contain what this paper meant. I folded it carefully, sliding it back into the torn envelope, which looked defeated now, like a messenger that had been forced into a job it never asked for. When I thanked him, he nodded with a solemnness that confirmed he knew more than he could say. He wasn't trying to pry into my personal life. He was handing me a key to the locked door I'd been circling for weeks. As I walked down the hallway, the overhead lights flickered, once catching my shadow at an angle. Splitting it briefly, an echo of the fractured reflections that had followed me from room to room. The air felt cooler near the stairwell, carrying the faint smell of industrial cleaner, and something else, something metallic like truth, sharpening itself. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long stripes across the parking lot. People left the building in clusters, talking, laughing, unaware that my world was tilting slightly out of alignment with each step I took. I sat in my car and unfolded the schedule again, pressing my palm over the text as though to steady it. Evan had signed out early. Not late, not delayed, not meeting anyone from his team. He had left without explanation and lied without hesitation. The paper in my hand didn't just contradict him, it unmasked him. I thought of the dim lamp in the cafe, the way he leaned toward her with a tenderness I hadn't seen in months. The screenshot, Ref LN 22. The appointment receipt with the mismatched hour. The reflection in Ref C09 shifting impossibly across the frame. And now this, a record of absence disguised as responsibility. I watched the office building through my windshield until the windows turned orange with sunset. Every piece of evidence fit into place with a precision that frightened me, not because it exposed betrayal, but because it revealed intention. He wasn't being careless. He was being consistent. The torn envelope lay open in my lap, the paper's edge fluttering each time the wind slipped through the crack of the window. I didn't know who tore it. I didn't know why it had nearly disappeared. But I knew the meaning someone knew more than I did, and someone tried to hide it. Not the woman, her posture, her hesitation, her discomfort were too genuine to fit this pattern. No, this was closer to home, closer to him. Maybe even his attempt to bury the contradiction. Maybe someone covering for him without understanding the consequences. The thought settled into me with a cold weight. I drove home slowly, the road stretching long and colorless beneath the fading light. When I reached the house, a shadow crossed the front window. Evan moving through the living room, unaware of how many of his secrets had already slipped into my hands. I paused in the driveway, letting the car idle, as I stared at the torn envelope beside me. Some lies don't collapse under evidence. They collapse under patterns too precise to deny. I tucked the envelope into my bag, the torn edge scraping lightly against the leather, and stepped out into the cooling air. A sense of direction formed in me, not a decision yet, but a trajectory. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be driven by doubt anymore. It would be driven by proof. I walked toward the door, steady, quiet, and certain. Storms gather slowly before they strike in one clean line. I didn't seek her out. Not intentionally, though the day seemed intent on pulling me toward the next fracture in the truth. The sky was a muted gray again, heavy with the kind of stillness that creates its own echo. I found myself in the parking structure of Evan's building, standing between rows of cars that gleamed dully beneath flickering overhead lights. I'd told myself I was only passing by. But that was a lie. I was there because the truth had become a thread pulling me forward, tightening with each step. I stood near a concrete pillar, the faint smell of exhaust settling in the cool air, when I noticed a small cigarette burn on the ground, dark circular, charred at the edges. It matched the mark I'd once seen on Evan's jacket shoulder. A tiny imprint, insignificant on its own, but now it felt like a breadcrumb placed deliberately in my path. I crouched, running my fingers lightly around the burned edge, feeling the rough texture beneath my skin. A sound echoed above me, footsteps light and hesitant. I rose slowly. She was there, the woman from the cafe. She leaned against the railing of the second level, her posture tense as she scrolled quickly through her phone. Her hair looked the same soft curls, a gentle frame around a face, carrying more unease than seduction. I moved quietly, staying hidden behind the pillar, the distance between us filled with questions I hadn't known how to ask. She wasn't smiling now. She wasn't leaning into anyone's presence. Her expression held something closer to fear or regret. A gust of wind swept through and she tucked her hair behind her ear with a quick shaking motion. The gesture was familiar, but this time it carried no charm. It was survival. She opened her messages and the glow of her screen illuminated her features. I saw a draft. The first line displayed clearly, "I can't do this anymore. You said you'd talk to her." My breath hitched a sharp intake that felt like a small betrayal of my own composure. She hadn't been pursuing him. She had been promised something he never gave her. She hovered over the draft thumb, trembling, as though she were weighing the cost of sending it. Then she pressed play on a partial audio clip, evidence number 6. A man's voice spilled from her phone, low and careful. Evan's voice. "Just trust me, okay? It's complicated with Claire. I need time. Don't walk away yet." His tone was far softer than the one he used with me. Softer, but also wrong. Not affectionate, not longing. Manipulative. Practiced. She flinched at the sound of it, pausing the recording, quickly glancing around, as though the walls themselves might be listening. Then she whispered something under her breath, words I barely caught. "You're not who you said you were." The reversal didn't break me. It rewrote the very shape of the truth. She wasn't competing with me. She was escaping him. The realization settled in my chest with a cold, unmistakable clarity. I had imagined her as the lure, the instigator, the woman who had caught his drifting attention. But she had been pulled into the same shadow I was standing in now. He had built 2 illusions, not just one. I looked at her again, seeing not a rival, but another casualty of his charm, another person wrapped in the quiet illusion of his sincerity. Her shoulders shook once as she steadied her breath. She wasn't here to meet him. She was here to end something, to warn herself, to leave. And suddenly the timeline shifted like a door unlocking. He hadn't stumbled into temptation. He had orchestrated it. He wasn't confused or drifting. He was engineering stories, parallel ones tailored for whoever stood in front of him. I watched her lift her phone to her ear, leaving a voicemail in a trembling voice. "I'm done, Evan. I mean it. Don't call me. Don't find me. Whatever you told her or didn't tell her, it's not my problem anymore. I won't be part of whatever this is." Each word struck like a quiet echo of my own thoughts. She ended the message abruptly, pressing the phone to her chest as if trying to quiet her heartbeat. She seemed younger in that moment, weighed down by something she hadn't consented to carry. She walked quickly toward her car, head down, keys shaking in her hand. For a moment she paused, as though considering whether she should look around. When she didn't, relief washed lightly across her face, relief at not being seen, not knowing I was there, witnessing the unraveling of something she'd been pulled into unwillingly. The truth wasn't a triangle. It was a trap with mirrored walls. I stayed hidden until her car pulled out of the structure, taillights fading into the gray distance. The silence that followed felt different than the silences before, heavier, but clearer. The cigarette burn on the concrete looked smaller now, not a clue leading me to her, but something left behind by someone who had been hurting just as quietly. I remained still, letting the wind settle around me, letting the pieces shift into their rightful places. The reflection-based contradictions, the mismatched schedules, the scent on his jacket, the screenshot at 10:14 p.m., all of it circled back, not to a moment of weakness, but to a pattern of control. Evan hadn't fallen into something he didn't understand. He had built layers of narrative to keep us both suspended in versions of him that didn't exist. The woman was his secret, yes, but not in the way I'd feared. She was proof of who he was when he thought no one was watching. When she vanished from sight, I finally exhaled. Slowly, deliberately. I stepped out from behind the pillar and looked at the cigarette burn one last time, feeling the cold certainty anchor itself deeper inside me. Truth sharpens when victims stop mistaking each other for enemies. After seeing her leave the parking structure, I drove home in a silence that felt less like absence and more like a verdict forming inside my chest. The city lights flickered weakly across the windshield, and every red light seemed to pause a little too long, as though the world itself were urging me to think harder to see clearer. By the time I pulled into our driveway, the air had grown colder, sharpening the edges of everything I touched. The living room greeted me with dimness when I stepped inside the hour, not late enough for night, but heavy enough for truth. I walked straight to my desk, the one place in the house that still felt like mine. Sitting at its center, right where I'd left it, was the audio recorder. I had bought it months earlier for work, intending to use it during event planning meetings, but it had gathered dust ever since. Now it felt like an object with purpose. I clicked it on the small light blinking red as though waking from a long sleep. Its emptiness comforted me. A clean slate, a place to store truth, not assumptions, not fears, facts. I opened my notebook, flipping past pages of scribbled reminders and half-finished lists until I reached the blank one at the back. I pressed the recorder to the paper for a moment, feeling its cool weight steady my thoughts. Evidence wasn't just collected, it was organized. And I needed organization more than oxygen now. Before I could begin listing the contradictions I already had, something slipped out of the notebook, slender, creased, and printed on thin thermal paper. A bank slip. My breath caught as I picked it up, smoothing the edge between my fingers. Assay 041. No amount listed. Evidence number 7. I didn't remember putting it there. Or maybe I had been too overwhelmed these past few weeks to track where I placed anything. But seeing it now felt like a message sent to myself from the version of me who still believed she could survive this unraveling. The bank slip was dated the same morning Evan claimed he had skipped breakfast to take an early meeting. But the slip was from an ATM miles away from his office, and minutes before he'd texted me saying he had just arrived. This wasn't coincidence. It wasn't forgetfulness. It was architecture-layered lies stacked deliberately like bricks intended to hold up a false version of him. My hands tightened around the slip as the timeline rearranged itself once more. Truth doesn't form from one fracture. It forms when every fracture points to the same break. I set the slip beside the audio recorder, the two objects forming a stark contrast: paper and metal past and present evidence and intention. I pressed record, letting the quiet click echo through the room. My voice came out softer than I expected. Asset reference. Evidence 7. Bank slip. Account ending in 041. Timestamp incompatible with stated schedule. The words felt procedural, almost detached, but detachment was what kept my mind steady. I continued speaking, cataloging everything that had led me here. Ref LN22, the cafe video, the mismatched appointment receipt, the fractured reflection from Ref C09, the torn envelope from Nolan. Evidence stacking like a staircase, leading to the final truth. When I stopped recording, the silence in the room deepened. I rested my fingertips against the recorder, letting its stillness anchor me. Evan walked in moments later, humming under his breath, unaware that anything in our life had shifted. "You're home early," he said, dropping his keys in the bowl with a clink. I turned the audio recorder over subtly in my hand so he couldn't see the blinking light. "Just needed some air," I said. He nodded, stretching slightly, the ease in his posture almost insulting. "Long day," he sighed, heading toward the kitchen. I followed at a distance, studying him with new precision. Everything about his movement looked casual, too casual the posture of someone who had no idea the walls were closing in around him. He pulled leftovers from the fridge, offering me dinner as though nothing were fractured. I declined. He shrugged, forked a small bite, and didn't push. I watched him for a long moment, the way his shoulders rose and fell, with each breath, the way he talked about work, as though the truth hadn't already begun to unravel behind him. Then carefully I asked, "Did you make it to your early meeting this morning?" He didn't even flinch. "Yeah," he said. "Traffic was terrible. Made me late." A lie delivered with the softness of habit. My grip around the bank slip tightened. I slipped it into my pocket before he could see it. He walked back into the living room, turning on the TV, settling into the couch like any ordinary evening. But nothing was ordinary anymore. I returned to my desk, the light from the small lamp casting a narrow halo over the recorder. I pressed play briefly, not to listen to my own words, but to hear the sound of the truth captured in motion. It steadied me. I slid the recorder into the drawer, slowly letting the wood close over it like sealing a promise. Some decisions don't erupt, they crystallize with the sound of your own voice naming the truth. I turned off the lamp and let the room sink into its natural shadows. Evan called out asking if I wanted to watch something with him. I didn't answer. I watched him through the doorway framed in the glow of the television, a silhouette built from practiced lies. The bank slip in my pocket felt sharper than the fractured reflections that had followed me for weeks. I stepped back slowly, letting the dark close around me like a curtain before a final act. The truth was no longer gathering. It was ready to strike. I didn't plan on confronting him that night, not in the sharp and final way it happened. But the truth has its own timing, and some nights feel designed for endings, whether you're ready for them or not. Evan was pacing near the window when I came downstairs, the glow of the street lamp carving thin bars of light across the living room floor. I could tell from his posture that he sensed something shifting in the air between us, though he didn't turn to face it. The audio recorder felt heavy in my hand, not because of its weight, but because of what it carried, everything he had tried to scatter across timelines and lies. I slipped the recorder into my pocket and walked into the hallway, needing one moment to steady myself before stepping through the final door. The cold doorknob chilled my palm as I held it, grounding me in the moment. The metal felt sharper than it should have, like it had been waiting for the truth longer than I had. I took a slow breath, feeling the coolness seep into my skin, anchoring me. When I pushed the door open, Evan finally turned. "Claire, you okay?" He asked the question, soft, rehearsed, gentle in a way that no longer touched me. "We need to talk," I said. He stiffened, hands slipping into his pockets as though hiding them might hide what he'd done. About what he replied too quickly. I moved to the center of the room, the audio recorder now visible in my hand. His gaze flicked to it, then away, then back again. "Where did you get that?" His voice wavered almost imperceptibly. "You left it behind," I said, and I pressed play. His face paled at the word. Play, what I pressed the button. The room filled with his voice, unfiltered, unguarded, stripped of the charm he wrapped himself in like a second skin. The recording began with a conversation I had never been meant to hear. His voice low and coaxing. "You don't get it. I need her steady. She doesn't do anything unless she feels secure. You..." A pause. A hitch in his breath. "You're different. I know what to say to you." The woman's voice trembled in response, barely audible. "You said you'd tell her the truth." Evan laughed in the recording, soft, careless. "She doesn't need the truth. She needs a story." I felt my ribs tighten around the sound. Evan took a step forward, panic rising. "Claire, wait." But the recording continued. "I'm not choosing anyone. I'm keeping balance. I get things from her I don't get from you. And from you, I get things she would never give. It's not complicated." My breath stilled entirely. He had said those words casually, like discussing the weather. Like my life was a ledger. Like she was a commodity. Like we were two parts of a machine designed to feed his ego. The next line struck harder. "She won't leave. She never does. She stays until I'm done writing the version of myself she needs. And when I'm finished, she finds her own way out. They always do." Hearing the truth in his own voice hurt less than realizing he believed every word. Evan lunged forward, grabbing for the recorder, but I stepped back, lifting it out of reach. "Stop!" He said the word sharp and thin. "You're twisting this." "I'm not twisting anything," I replied. "You are." He opened his mouth, then closed it, searching for the charm that usually rescued him from consequences. But charm only works on people who want to be charmed, and I didn't, not anymore. The recording kept playing. "I don't care if she sees us. Let her assume what she wants. Suspicion keeps her close. Closeness keeps her predictable." His words cracked something in the woman's voice. "You're using both of us," she whispered. Evan didn't deny it. "Balance," he repeated. "I need balance." I pressed stop. The silence afterward felt colder than the metal of the doorknob. Evan stared at me, his face stripped of every performance. "Claire," he said, his voice trembling, "it's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think," I said quietly. "Probably worse." He ran his hand through his hair, pacing, searching for an angle that didn't exist. I was scared he tried. Scared of losing control, scared of losing you. Then why lie, I asked. Why not tell the truth? "Because the truth doesn't keep people," he said, before realizing how that sounded. He froze. I watched him struggle with the weight of his own reasoning, watched him try to rearrange the pieces into a shape that made him look like a man instead of a shadow. "I didn't think you'd leave," he said finally, almost whispering. "You always stay." I felt something shift inside me, something quiet and irreversible. Not anger, not betrayal. Clarity, complete clarity. Knowing the truth didn't break me. It freed me from holding someone I had already lost. He tried again. "I can fix this. I can change." But his voice carried no conviction. It was a script he'd used before, maybe not with me, but with someone. With her. With others. And the realization struck like a cold blade. I wasn't the first. I stepped back toward the hallway recorder still in hand. "You won't fix it," I said softly, "because you don't believe it's broken." His breath stuttered. For a moment his eyes held something like desperation. But desperation isn't love. It's fear of consequence. I turned toward the door, placing my hand once again on the cold metal knob. The chill no longer grounded me, it pushed me forward. Evan took a step. "Where are you going?" I paused. Then I looked back at him, and the answer felt simpler than breathing. "Away from the story you wrote for me." I opened the door slowly, letting the hallway light spill in. Truth closes the door long before you turn the handle. The morning after the recording shattered what was left of our marriage, the house felt like a shell I had temporarily stepped inside rather than a place I lived. Light crept in slowly, thin and uncertain, as though even the sun wasn't sure it should enter. I stood in the kitchen staring at the table where I had arranged the pieces of our unraveling the night before. At the center sat the receipt slip, an unassuming rectangle of paper that had once meant nothing and now meant everything. I placed it gently between evidence number 3 and number 7, not because I needed more proof, but because order soothed the final tremors still moving through me. I wasn't shaking from heartbreak anymore. I was shaking from direction. Evan came downstairs wearing the same expression he always used on difficult mornings, soft concern masking self-protection. "Claire," he said carefully, like the word itself might break if he spoke it too loudly. I didn't look at him. I was busy straightening the edges of the evidence array, making sure everything lined up. "We should talk," he said. "No," I answered. "We shouldn't." He exhaled, frustrated, as though I were the unreasonable one. "I said things I didn't mean. People say stupid things when they're scared." "You meant every word I replied, still not facing him. Your voice doesn't lie the way your face does." He fell quiet. I could feel him recalibrating, searching for a version of the man he thought I wanted him to be. But the versions no longer mattered. I picked up the receipt slip and held it between us, letting him see its timestamp, its location, its quiet contradiction of every alibi he'd given me that day. "This," I said softly, "isn't about fear. It's about choice. All of your choices." I set it back down and finally turned to him. His posture crumpled, a little shoulders, lowered mouth tightening. "I didn't want to lose you," he murmured, stepping closer. "You were slipping away." "And I wasn't slipping," I said. I was standing still while you rearranged the truth around me." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing now, touching objects idly, as though grounding himself in the house he still believed belonged to us. I opened a drawer, pulled out a folder, and placed every piece of evidence inside it. My movements were precise, almost quiet in their certainty. He noticed the folder and paused. "What is that documentation?" I said. "I'm giving myself clarity." He swallowed. "Clarity for what?" "For leaving," I answered. The decision didn't strike like lightning. It settled like dawn finally reaching the window. He stared at me, waiting for the punchline he was certain must come. When none arrived, he moved closer, panic rising in his eyes. "Claire, you can't just walk out. You don't walk out. That's not who you are. It is now." "Let's slow down," he said, holding his palms up like I was something dangerous. "We can talk. We can fix this." "You can talk," I said. "You've perfected that. But I'm done listening." He stepped in front of the door, blocking the exit out of reflex rather than aggression. A subtle, desperate move. I walked past him without hesitation, stopping only to let my fingers brush the receipt slip one last time before sliding it into the folder. "You built an entire world on the assumption that I would stay no matter what I said quietly. But the truth is simple. I stayed because I didn't know what you were." He winced. "And now I do." I moved around him again, the space between us, narrowing then widening like a door opening at last. He followed me to the hallway, his footsteps uneven. "If you leave," he said, "everything collapses." "No," I corrected. "Everything already collapsed. I'm just stepping out of the rubble." He grabbed my arm, not forcefully, but urgently. "Where will you even go?" "Forward," I said. He let go as though the word burned him. I retrieved my suitcase from the bedroom, the same one I had imagined gripping in part 1. The weight of it felt right in my hand, earned, chosen, inevitable. When I came back into the living room, Evan looked smaller somehow, as if he had deflated under the gravity of consequences he never believed would arrive. "You can't do this," he whispered. "I already have," I replied. Freedom doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sounds like a door opening without hesitation. He stepped aside, then almost involuntarily, as though some small part of him understood that this moment wasn't his to control. I walked toward the front door folder in one hand, suitcase in the other. When my fingers touched the knob, it wasn't cold this time. It was neutral, like something that simply existed between two worlds. I paused only long enough to take one last look at the man who had built a life on reflections instead of truth. "Goodbye, Evan," I said. Not with anger, not with sorrow, with clarity. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Not lies, not apologies, not promises, just silence, the first honest thing he'd given me in months. I stepped through the doorway and let it close softly behind me, the morning air brushing against my face like something newly alive. I didn't look back. Some endings feel like the first real step you've taken in years. The present folds around me the moment I step outside, crisp air brushing across my face like a quiet acknowledgement that the world has already continued without waiting for either of us. I stand on the walkway, suitcase at my side, the sky washed in a pale early light that feels neither hopeful nor grim, just honest. My hand closes around the trembling key, its slight vibration, nothing more than the echo of my own pulse running through it. I turn it once between my fingers, feeling its smooth edges, its tiny imperfections, its history. This key once opened a door to a life I mistook for stability. Now it is simply a piece of metal freed from the illusions that gave it importance. I keep it in my palm as I move down the driveway, not ready to discard it yet, not ready to place it into a pocket where it might hide. Leaving isn't a dramatic act. It's a practiced exhale, a quiet alignment between who I was and who I am finally willing to become. The morning is still. Birds move somewhere in the distance, and a car hums along the far end of the street, indifferent to the end of my marriage. I pause at the edge of the sidewalk, letting the weight of the moment settle. The house behind me looks the same as it did yesterday, the same as it did last week, as though nothing inside it had been dismantled. But I know better. He's inside that stillness, pacing, perhaps remembering, denying, repeating, unraveling. But none of that belongs to me anymore. I lift the trembling key, slightly watching it glint in the dim light. The reflection shifts across its surface, as though the world is adjusting its shape just enough to signal the next chapter. I breathe deeply, letting the cool air anchor me to the present. I walk slowly toward the corner, each step steady, each movement intentional. The key warms slightly against my skin the longer I hold it, no longer trembling, no longer echoing the uncertainty of moments past. I think of the first reflections that warned me, the faint shimmer across the kitchen window, the fractured light on the mirror shard, the angles in the camera clip that betrayed him before he could betray himself. The world had been whispering truth long before I was ready to hear it. And now the world isn't whispering at all. It's listening. My phone buzzes in my bag once, then twice, but I don't reach for it. I don't need to hear apologies shaped like strategies or pleas shaped like dependence. I keep walking. The neighborhood is waking slowly. Curtains opening, engines starting, dogs being led into yards, as if this morning is like any other. But for me, the air feels newly minted. I reach the end of the block and turn left, the suitcase wheels rumbling softly along the pavement. A quiet rhythm, a small reminder that movement is a choice. Halfway down the next street, I stop beside a brick wall and rest the suitcase upright. The key is still in my hand. I look at it once more, the metal now steady and warm. I turn it between my fingers, remembering the door it belongs to, the life it unlocked, the lies it hung behind. Then I look up at the sky clearer now, the light catching on the faintest trace of morning gold. I'm not walking away from something. I'm walking toward the first version of myself that isn't shaped by someone else. I curl my fingers around the key one final time. There is no anger in the motion, only release. With a slow exhale, I slip it into the pocket of my coat, not as a reminder of him, but as a symbol of the moment I stopped allowing shadows to define my choices. It rests there quietly, no longer trembling. The street stretches ahead, open, unassuming, waiting. I retrieve my suitcase and start moving again each step, easing the last weight from my shoulders. A few houses down, I pass a window whose glass glimmers faintly in the sun. For a brief moment, I catch my reflection, clear, steady, unbroken by the distortions that once hovered around me. I pause, letting the simplicity of it settle into my bones. The reflection doesn't tremble. It doesn't fracture. It simply exists, and it belongs wholly to me. The final reflection holds nothing I still fear. The wind shifts gently, brushing through my hair, carrying with it the quiet promise of something unknown but honest. I take another step, then another, the weight of the suitcase pulling lightly at my arm, not burdening, just reminding me I am in motion, alive, choosing free. At the corner, I glance back only once, not at the house, not at the window, but at the path I've already walked. Then I face forward again and keep going, the morning unfolding softly around me, patient and new.